The year is 480 BC. 300 Spartans stand in a narrow mountain pass, staring down the largest army the world has ever seen. You've heard that story before, right? Thermopylae, the famous last stand. But what if I told you there was another battle just as crucial where Spartans achieved something even more extraordinary? A battle where they killed 10,000 Persian soldiers without losing a single man, not one. 0 casualties. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? Like something out of a myth or a video game. But this actually happened, and the story of how they pulled it off is so brilliant, so perfectly executed, that it changed the course of Western civilization. This is the Battle of Plataea, and buckle up because you're about to discover why it's the most underrated military victory in ancient history. Before we dive into the main event, we need to set the stage, because this battle didn't happen in isolation. It was the culmination of years of conflict between the massive Persian Empire and the Greek city-states. And when I say massive, I mean Persia-controlled territory, from what is now Pakistan, all the way to Egypt and into Eastern Europe. They were the superpower of the ancient world, and Greece was just this collection of independent cities that couldn't stop fighting each other long enough to agree on anything. But somehow, against all odds, these Greeks were about to hand Persia one of the most devastating defeats in military history. Let's rewind a bit to understand how we got here. In 490 BC, the Persian king Darius sent an expedition to punish Athens for supporting a rebellion in his empire. The Persians landed at Marathon with about 25,000 troops, expecting an easy victory. Instead, the Athenians and their allies from Platea, yes, that name will come up again, crushed them in what became known as the Battle of Marathon. The Persians lost over 6,000 men, while the Greeks lost fewer than 200. It was humiliating for the greatest empire on earth to be defeated by what they considered a bunch of backwater barbarians. But here's the thing about empires. They don't forget, they don't forgive, and they certainly don't let defeats go unanswered. Darius began preparing for a second invasion, but he died before he could launch it. His son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the grudge. Xerxes spent years assembling the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen. Ancient historians claim he had over 1 million men, though modern scholars think it was probably closer to 150 to 300,000, which is still absolutely enormous for that time period. To put that in perspective, that's like if Canada decided to invade the United States with an army the size of every single person living in Iceland showing up at your doorstep. In 480 BC, Xerxes crossed from Asia into Europe with his massive army. The Greek city-states, finally realizing they were all going to die unless they worked together, formed an alliance. Sparta, the most feared military power in Greece, took command of the allied forces. This is where we get that famous stand at Thermopylae. King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, along with several thousand other Greek allies, held a narrow mountain pass for 3 days against the entire Persian army. They killed somewhere between 10 to 20,000 Persians before being betrayed by a local Greek who showed the Persians a secret path around the pass. Leonidas sent most of his army away and stayed with his 300 Spartans and some other volunteers to cover the retreat. They were annihilated, but they bought precious time for Greece to prepare. The Persians pushed south, burning Athens to the ground. The situation looked hopeless. But then something remarkable happened. At Salamis, a narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Greek mainland, the Greek navy, led by the Athenian commander Themistocles, lured the Persian fleet into confined waters and destroyed it. The Persian navy was decimated. Without naval superiority, Xerxes couldn't supply his massive army through the winter. He had to make a choice. He left behind a smaller force, though smaller is relative because it was still about 100,000 men under his best general Mardonius, and returned to Persia with the rest of his army. Mardonius spent the winter in northern Greece, specifically in the region of Thessaly, which had sided with Persia. He tried diplomacy first, offering the Athenians generous terms if they would switch sides. Can you imagine? After burning their city to the ground, he's like, "Hey, no hard feelings, want to join us?" The Athenians told him exactly where he see. I'll stick his offer. Sparta, meanwhile, was being Sparta. They were super concerned about defending the Peloponnese, the southern peninsula of Greece, and wanted to build a wall across the narrow isthmus and defend there. The Athenians were furious. Build a wall? Their city was already destroyed, and Sparta wanted to abandon the rest of Greece. This disagreement nearly tore the Greek alliance apart, but eventually Sparta agreed to send their army north, and when Sparta sent their army, they didn't mess around. The Spartan king Pausanias, who was actually Leonidas's nephew and serving as regent for Leonidas's young son, led the Spartan force. Each Spartan warrior was accompanied by 7 helots, the enslaved people who served Sparta, so when Sparta committed 5,000 Spartans to the battle, they showed up with about 40,000 people total. Combined with forces from Athens, Corinth, Megara, Tegea, and dozens of other city-states, the Greek army numbered somewhere around 70 to 80,000 men. For once, the Greeks actually had comparable numbers to their enemy. Now here's where it gets interesting. Mardonius had positioned his army near the city of Platea, in the region of Boeotia. He chose this location because it was relatively flat and open, perfect for his cavalry, which was one of Persia's greatest advantages. The Greeks were primarily heavy infantry. They didn't have much cavalry to speak of. Mardonius figured he could use his horsemen to harass and destroy the Greek army in the open field. The Greeks, knowing this, took up a defensive position in the foothills of Mount Cithaeron. They had the high ground and could use the terrain to neutralize the Persian cavalry advantage. What followed was over a week of the strangest standoff you can imagine. Both armies just sat there, watching each other. Mardonius wanted the Greeks to come down into the plains where his cavalry could work. Pausanias wanted Mardonius to attack uphill where the terror in would favor Greek heavy infantry. Neither side wanted to give the other the advantage. So they waited, and waited. The Persian cavalry would ride out and harass the Greek positions, shoot some arrows, throw some javelins, then ride away. The Greeks would hold formation and take it. This went on for days. But Mardonius was getting frustrated. He had the larger army, but feeding it was becoming a problem. The Greek navy controlled the seas, which meant Persian supplies had to come overland from the north, and Greek raiders were constantly attacking these supply lines. Meanwhile, the Greeks were getting supplies from the nearby cities that supported them. Mardonius needed to force a decisive battle soon, or his army would start to weaken from lack of food and supplies. So he came up with a plan. He sent his cavalry to capture and destroy the Gargantian spring, which was the main water source for the Greek army. They succeeded. Suddenly, the Greeks were in serious trouble. Tens of thousands of men without water in the heat of summer? That's a death sentence. Pausanias called a council of war. They decided they had to move to a new position, closer to Platea itself, where they could access water and also be in a better defensive position. They planned to move at night to avoid the Persian cavalry. But here's where things started to go wrong for the Greeks. Moving tens of thousands of men in the dark over several miles is incredibly difficult, even with modern technology and communications. With nothing but moonlight and runners carrying messages, it's a recipe for disaster, and disaster is exactly what they got. Different units got confused about where they were supposed to go. Some moved too far, some didn't move far enough, and by dawn the Greek army was scattered across the plain in several separate groups. When Mardonius saw this in the morning light, he couldn't believe his luck. The Greek army, which had been in a strong defensive position, was now scattered and disorganized in the open plain. This was exactly what he'd been waiting for. He immediately ordered his entire army to attack. The Persian and allied troops surged forward. Mardonius personally led his elite 10,000 immortals, the Persian royal guard, in a charge toward the Spartan position. The Spartans, about 11,000 strong, including their allied Tegean troops and the Helots, suddenly found themselves isolated and facing the bulk of the Persian army. This is it. This is the moment where that incredible feat of arms happens. But before we get there, you need to understand what made Spartan soldiers so terrifying. From age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and put into the agoge, a brutal military training program that lasted until they were 30. They learned to endure pain, hardship, and suffering. They trained constantly in formation fighting. They were beaten if they showed weakness. They were starved to teach them to steal food, and beaten worse if they got caught, not for stealing but for being bad at it. The entire Spartan society existed for one purpose: to produce the most effective heavy infantry soldiers in the world. And they absolutely succeeded. A Spartan warrior wore a bronze helmet, a bronze breastplate, bronze greaves on his shins, and carried a large round shield called an aspis, about 3 feet in diameter. His primary weapon was a spear about 7 to 9 feet long, and he carried a short sword as a backup. But the real weapon wasn't the spear or the shield. It was the phalanx formation. Spartans fought shoulder to shoulder in ranks, usually 8 men deep. Each man's shield protected not just himself, but the man to his left. The front rank would present a wall of shields with spears protruding forward. If someone in the front fell, the man behind would step up immediately. It was like fighting a mobile fortress made of bronze and human determination. The Persians, on the other hand, had a different fighty, NG style. They were skilled warriors, don't get me wrong, but they relied more on archery and mobility. They wore lighter armor, mostly leather with some metal scales. Their shields were made of wicker, which could stop arrows but weren't great against spears in close combat. Their tactics involved shooting arrows to soften up the enemy, then closing in for melee. Against most enemies this worked brilliantly. Against Spartans in phalanx formation, not so much. So picture this scene. The sun is rising over the plains of Platea. The Spartans and Tegians, about 11,000 men total, are in formation. Facing them are perhaps 50 to 60,000 Persian and allied troops, including Mardonius's elite immortals. The Persians advance, thousands of archers shooting arrows that darken the sky. The Spartans hunker down behind their shields, the arrows clattering off bronze like deadly rain. The Spartans don't break formation. They don't run. They just endure. This is what they've tried for their entire lives. According to Herodotus, our main source for this battle, the Spartans delayed their advance because the omens from the animal sacrifices weren't favorable. Now, you might think this is just ancient superstition, but there's probably a tactical reason buried in there. Pausanias was waiting for the right moment. He needed the Persians to commit fully, to getting close where the Greek advantage in heavy infantry combat would matter most. So the Spartans stood there, taking arrow fire, waiting. Men were getting hit, men were dying, but the formation held. Then the omens became favorable. Or Pausanias decided the moment was right. The Spartans began to advance. Now, imagine you're a Persian soldier. You've been shooting arrows at these Greek warriors for who knows how long. Some of them have fallen, but most of them are still standing. And now this wall of bronze and crimson cloaks is moving toward you. It's not rushing, it's not charging wildly, it's advancing at a steady, measured pace, maintaining perfect formation, shields locked, spears leveled, absolutely silent, except for the rhythmic tramping of thousands of feet and the clanking of armor. It's like watching an avalanche of bronze slowly, inevitably rolling toward you. The Persian wicker shields couldn't stop the long Spartan spears. When the lines crashed together, the superior armor, weapons, and training of the Spartans immediately became apparent. The Spartans pushed forward like a machine. The Persians, brave as they were, couldn't match them in close combat. They tried to grab the Spartan spears and break them. Some succeeded, but a Spartan with a broken spear simply drew his sword and kept fighting. The Persian lines began to buckle, but Mardonius wouldn't let them break. He rallied his men. He fought at the front himself, as kings and generals did in those days. A fierce, brutal melee developed around his position. The battle hung in the balance. Then Mardonius was killed. A Spartan soldier struck him down. With their general dead, the morale of the Persian center collapsed. They began to retreat, not a panicked rout yet, but a fighting withdrawal. The Spartans pursued, maintaining their formation, pushing forward relentlessly. This entire engagement, this brutal close-quarters fighting, lasted for hours. But here's the thing. The Spartans didn't lose a single man. 0. Not one Spartan died in this engagement. Now, does that mean literally not one Spartan was killed? Maybe a few were, and the ancient sources exaggerated. Ancient historians weren't always precise with casualty figures, but even if we assume there were some Spartan casualties, the number was so small, so close to zero, that ancient sources recorded it as none. That's absolutely extraordinary. Meanwhile, on another part of the battlefield, the Athenians were facing a different challenge. They were engaging the Greek allies of Persia, particularly the Thebans, who were excellent warriors themselves. This fight was tough, brutal, and costly. The Athenians took significant casualties, but eventually drove the Thebans back. The rest of the Persian line, seeing their center collapsing and Mardonius dead, began to retreat in earnest. The retreat turned into a rout. The Persians fled back to their fortified camp, a wooden palisade they'd constructed to serve as their base. The Greeks pursued. When they reached the Persian camp, another problem emerged. The Spartans, for all their skill in open battle, weren't great at siege warfare or storming fortifications. The Persians had barricaded themselves behind wooden walls and were defending desperately. The Spartans tried to force their way in, but struggled. Then the Athenians arrived. The Athenians, being more flexible in their thinking and tactics, figured out how to breach the walls. Once the Greeks got inside the camp, it became a massacre. The Persians, trapped, exhausted, and demoralized, were slaughtered by the thousands. Out. Of the roughly 100,000 men Mardonius had led, only about 3,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The Greeks lost in total maybe 1,500 men, though sources vary. The Spartans themselves lost virtually none in the main battle, though some helots died in the fighting. This is where that number of 10,000 Persian dead killed by Spartans specifically comes from. Ancient sources record that the Spartan contingent was responsible for a huge portion of the Persian casualties, particularly the slaughter of Mardonius's elite troops in that central engagement. The combination of their superior equipment, training, formation fighting, and the fact that they were facing the best Persian troops head-on meant they did a disproportionate amount of the killing. And they did it while taking essentially no casualties themselves. It's a feat of arms that's almost unbelievable, but it's corroborated by multiple ancient sources. But why? How did they achieve Let's break it down. First, equipment. The Spartans had bronze armor that could stop arrows and deflect sword strikes. The Persians had lighter armor that couldn't stop the long Spartan spears. Second, formation. The phalanx was a devastating formation in pitched battle. It concentrated force and protected soldiers. The Persians fought in a looser formation that, while flexible, couldn't match the phalanx's staying power in a direct push. Third, training. Every Spartan was a professional soldier who'd trained since childhood. Most Persian soldiers were conscripts from across the empire with varying levels of skill. Fourth, morale and discipline. The Spartans were legendary for their refusal to break or retreat. They would die in formation before they'd run. This psychological factor alone was devastating to enemies. Fifth, and this is crucial, leadership. Pausanias made the right decision. He held his ground, didn't let the Persians draw him into unfavorable terrain, and struck at exactly the right moment. Mardonius, for all his skill, made the fatal error of committing his best troops to a direct assault on the Spartan position. He played into their greatest strength. If he'd been more patient, if he'd continued to use his cavalry to harass and weaken the Greeks, the outcome might have been different. But he was under pressure from his own supply problems and his king's expectations. He felt he had to force a decisive battle. That decision cost him his life and his army. The aftermath of Platea was monumental. With this defeat, Persia's attempt to conquer mainland Greece was finished. They'd lost 2 major battles at Salamis and Platea, lost tens of thousands of men, and lost their best general. Xerxes never attempted another invasion. Persia remained a powerful empire, but they never again seriously threatened Greece proper. The Greek city-states, having proven they could defeat the greatest empire in the world, entered a golden age of culture, philosophy, art, and democracy. Everything we associate with classical Greece, the Parthenon, the plays of Sophocles and Euripides, the philosophy of Socrates and Plato, the democracy of Athens, all of this emerged in the decades following these victories. It's not an exaggeration to say that Western civilization, as we know it, might not exist if the Greeks had lost at Platea. And yet, Platea doesn't get the recognition it deserves. Everyone knows about Thermopylae. 300 Spartans holding off the Persian hordes makes for a great story, and it is a great story. But Platea was the actual decisive victory. Thermopylae was a heroic defeat. Platea was a triumph that changed history. Maybe it's because last stands and noble sacrifices make better movies. Maybe it's because the tactical details of Platea are more complex and harder to dramatize. Or maybe it's because acknowledging just how dominant the Spartans were at Platea, killing thousands without losing anyone, seems too fantastic to be real. But it was real. The Spartans really did achieve something close to a perfect military victory that day. They faced down a much larger force, killed thousands of elite enemy troops, and suffered virtually no casualties themselves. It's a testament to what professional training, superior equipment, brilliant tactics, and unbreakable morale can achieve. Modern militaries study Platea in war colleges to this day because it demonstrates fundamental principles of warfare that remain true across millennia. Concentration of force, fighting on favorable terrain, maintaining unit cohesion, and exploiting enemy mistakes. There's something else worth noting about Platea. It was a true alliance victory. The Spartans held the center and bore the brunt of the fighting against Mardonius's best troops, but the Athenians fought bravely on the left wing. The Tegeans fought alongside the Spartans. Soldiers from Corinth, Megara, Sicyon, Epidaurus, Troezen, and dozens of other city-states all played their part. These Greek cities spent most of their time fighting each other, but when faced with an existential threat, they came together and achieved something extraordinary. It's a reminder that people who usually can't agree on anything can still unite when it really matters. After the battle, the Greeks gathered to distribute honors. There was debate about who deserved the most credit. The Spartans had done the heaviest fighting. The Athenians had stormed the camp and contributed the navy that made the whole campaign possible. It got heated, as these things do. Eventually, they compromised. The Spartans were awarded the prize for valor, but the Athenians received honors for their contributions too. Pausanias, the Spartan commander, was celebrated throughout Greece. Unfortunately for him, the story doesn't end well. Years later, he was accused of plotting with Persia, the very enemy he'd defeated, and died a hunted man, allegedly walled up alive in a temple where he'd taken sanctuary. But that's a story for another day. The legacy of Platea lived on in Sparta. The warriors who fought there were celebrated for generations. The battle became proof of Spartan superiority in warfare. It reinforced everything Spartan society believed about itself, that their brutal training system, their rigid social structure, their entire way of life was justified because it produced warriors who could achieve the impossible. For better or worse, Platea validated Sparta's militaristic culture for the next century and a half, until they finally met their match at Leuctra in 371 BC. But in 479 BC, standing on the plains of Platea, with 10,000 enemy dead scattered across the field and virtually no losses of their own, the Spartans were at the absolute pinnacle of their power and prestige. They had accomplished what no other army in the ancient world could match. They had fought a perfect battle. They had killed thousands of the Persian Empire's best warriors, while suffering almost no casualties themselves. They had proven that discipline, training, and courage could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. So when you think about ancient battles, yes, remember Thermopylae, remember the heroic sacrifice of Leonidas and his 300, but remember Platea too. Remember the battle where Spartans didn't die gloriously in a last stand, but instead achieved something even more remarkable. They won, completely, decisively, perfectly. They killed 10,000 enemies without losing a man, and in doing so, they saved Western civilization from Persian conquest. That's not mythology, that's not Hollywood, that's history, and it's absolutely incredible. The Battle of Plataea stands as perhaps the most complete military victory in ancient warfare, a masterclass in tactics, discipline, and the devastating effectiveness of the Spartan way of war. And now you know the story.